Good morning. We are on the left-hand side, bottom left of page 34, looking at the Rebbe's analysis of the last lines of the tractate Sotah. So let's bring us to where we are. Rabbi Yosef said, don't include in the list of characters or qualities that are gone. Don't include humility on that list because I'm humble. And Rabbi Nachman said, don't include on the list of qualities that are gone the quality of fear of sin, because I have fear of sin. Right? And we were discussing the Rebbe's position that considering that they each selected one and didn't speak of the other means they're disputing, which means in Rabbi Nachman's view, humility is gone. Humility is gone. And in Rabbi Yosef's view, fear of sin is gone. Now, why is that? So we explained yesterday like this, starting with the position of Rabbi Yosef and his question of humility. We explained that humility from the Hasidic perspective on its deeper level is not simply to be self-effacing and to deny the fact that Hashem has granted qualities, but on the contrary, to acknowledge that the qualities that one has is a gift from Hashem, and therefore the person's humble about them. If someone else had these qualities, maybe they do a better job. And Rabbi Yosef looked at his own humility as one such quality. The very fact that I have the ability to acknowledge everything as a gift from Hashem is itself a gift from Hashem. And therefore, he wasn't arrogant about his humility. He was humble about his humility. It's a gift I have. It's not like I earned anything to get this humility. It's this Hashem made me. Hashem made me with humility. Now, as for the fact, and the same thing with Torah learning, Hashem granted him the mind to be able to learn. Now, as for the fact that Rabbi Yosef knew about himself that he doesn't sin, he said, I'm not really in fear of sin. It's the Torah that prevents me from sinning. So I cannot say that the quality of fear of sin still exists, because even the fact that I don't sin is not because I have become a person who is fearful of sin, but because the Torah prevents me.
It's just a consequence.
It's a consequence of the other gift Hashem gave me. Hashem gave me a gift of Torah learning, and that Torah learning prevents me from sinning. So actually, the fact that he looked at fear of sin as something that's no longer itself part of his humility, thinking to himself that even the fact that I don't sin is not, I earned it. I became a person who's fear of sin. As a consequence of the gift of Torah study, I don't sin. Now the question becomes in the reverse. Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman, who said, fear of sin is no longer, because I am fearful of sin. Why didn't he acknowledge the humility of his friend, Rav Yosef? Right? We now know why Rav Yosef didn't acknowledge the fear of sin of his friend, because to him, fear of sin is the consequence of the gift of Torah study. But now, conversely, Rav Nachman, who says, I have fear of sin, so that he thinks is a quality he achieved, but for some reason, the humility that his friend Rav Yosef has is not enough for him to be convinced that humility is still around. So let's see.
They're both on the same track.
That's the point, but they have a different opinion as to how they look at these things. Let's see that is. The bottom left, second to last paragraph on page 34. Valpizeh, based on this, Yesh Nevayer, we might suggest the following explanation. Masha Reb Nachman, that which Reb Nachman, Amar said, like Tisnei Rak Yidaschet, he says, only remove fear of sin from the list of things that have no longer, because I am fearful of sin, said Reb Nachman. Avalal Nava, but humility, Batla, that is no longer. Ladaitoi in his view, in Reb Nachman's view. Misha Meis Rebbe, once Rebbe passed away, as the Mishnah comments. Av Sheyada, even though Rav Nachman was fully aware, Gadlusoi, Vanvaslusoi, Sharab Yosef, even though he knew the greatness and humility of his friend Rabbi Yosef, he nonetheless maintained humility is no longer. But fear of saying, yes, that does exist. Why is that? Rav Nachman Polig al Rav Yosef. Rav Nachman disagrees with Rav Yosef in the following manner. The Sovar, Rav Nachman is of the view, Shelimud HaTorah, the learning of Torah, top of 35. Poyol Shinei Ba'adam, does change the person. How long that learns it? Achein Shayach Lachit, to the point that he is incapable of sinning. So to explain, we said yesterday that there are two ways in which we can consider the effect Torah has on preventing one from sin. One way is, and this was Rav Yosef's view, that the person on his own merit may be still capable of sinning. But the Torah he learned prevents him as an exterior barrier from sinning. But the other view, the other way of thinking about it is that the study of Torah itself transforms the person himself, that he no longer is desiring sin, and he becomes a person who fears sin.
That's Rav Nachman's view.
And that's Rav Nachman's view. Rav Nachman says that when a person studies Torah, it's not just an external factor that stops him from sinning, but actually the Torah itself transforms him and he becomes a person who's fearful of sin. And therefore, V'meila, Lo Yahaya Rav Yosef Yachal Liyas Anav. And therefore, Rav Nachman says to Rav Yosef, you can't be humble because you earned the right to say that you are fearful of sin. The reason for humility, as we explained, is because the person says, everything I have is a gift from Hashem. And exactly. And if Yosef says, my fear of sin is also a gift from Hashem. I study Torah and it prevents me from sinning.
Not
direct consequence. It's just an external force. But Rav Nachman turns to his friend of Yosef and says, no, you earn the right to be fearful of sin. And therefore you use humility. You use your humility. So it's ironic. The fact, that was beautiful, like twist on the whole plot here. The fact that Rav Nachman says to his friend of Yosef, you're not humble, is actually it's out of praise of him. Not by slighting. Exactly. You earned your fear of sin. You can't call yourself humble. So it's not like he's looking down and says, now you're arrogant. You're not humble. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying is you can't claim to be completely, fully humble because look, you earned the right to brag about your fear of sin. Because you've been transformed into a man who fears sin. Whereas Rav Yosef responded saying, no, the fact that I don't sin is not because of me, because of the gift Hashem gave me of Torah. So they're actually complementing each other.
They're both right.
Exactly. Sorry?
Both on the same track.
That's right. The difference is, Rav Yosef's of the view that when a person studies Torah, it doesn't change him, it just holds him back from sinning technically, but he himself could be someone who's capable of sinning. And therefore, in his humility, he said, I'm not fearful of sin, Torah prevents me. Whereas Rav Yosef says, no, when you learn Torah, you become a different person. You become one who's fearful of sin, and therefore you, Rav Yosef, can't be that humble. You got to own up to the fact that you earn the right to say you're fearful of sin. As Rav Nachman said about himself, considering his own Torah study.
They're both Torah scholars.
Correct.
So what are you studying?
That's right.
What are you studying Torah for if you're not going to follow it?
No. So of course the question, you're going to follow it. The question is, how does Torah affect the person not to sin? In what way?
It's either indirect.
Is it external? So there's two ways of thinking about it. One way of thinking about it is Torah. It doesn't necessarily mean that I have become a person who doesn't sin. It just holds me back because I can't sin.
You want to.
But whereas Rav Nachman says, no, when you learn Torah enough, you actually become transformed to the kind of person where you yourself are afraid of sin. Not just because Torah is holding you back, but because you actually are fearful of it. You become that kind of person. And therefore, Rav Nachman looks at Rav Yosef and says, you can't be that humble because you've earned the right to say you're fearful of sin. Whereas Rav Yosef says, I didn't earn that right. It's just Torah holding me back. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Where they're actually complementing each other in their disagreement. Okay. Continues there with Vav. And the whole Vav is one big parenthesis, but still, it helps us understand. Yeah, the whole Vav, the whole part 6. And then we're going to skip 7. We're going to skip Zion. So that's a little bit of a tangent. So now everybody's going to address the following. Why didn't Rav Yosef say, my friend Rav Nachman earned the fear of sin? That we haven't explained yet. Rav Yosef says, I'm humble in his humility because it's a gift from Hashem. Rav Yosef says, I'm not fearful of sin because it's only Torah that prevents me. I didn't become a fearful of sin person. But why didn't he say, in praising his friend Rav Nachman, that Rav Nachman is fearful of sin? Why didn't he say that? Following the question? Rav Yosef says, humility still exists because I'm humble. Why didn't he say fear of sin also still exists because my friend Rav Nachman is fearful of sin? Okay, I'm not fearful of sin because it's a gift from Hashem, the Torah prevents me. But why didn't he compliment his friend and say, hey, look, my friend is fearful of sin? So says they're going to be like this. And somewhat similar to this, the Rabbi highlights the word al derech. Yesh liyashiv, we can explain Gam Masher of Yosef, that which of Yosef Amar did not say Latana to the editor of the Mishnah, like Tisni Yiras, don't include fear of sin on the list of things that are no longer Dikar of Nachman because my friend is here. Why didn't he compliment his friend of Nachman and say, hey, look, my friend of Nachman is fearful of sin, don't put it on the list of things that are gone? Why didn't he say that? So he said there like this. This is beautiful. The Gemara tells us the following story about Rav Nachman's childhood. The aim of Rav Nachman.
Can you repeat the question again?
Why didn't Rav Yosef say, Rav Yosef said, humility still exists because I'm here, right? Why didn't he say fear of sin still exists because my friend Rav Nachman is here? Maybe his own fear of sin he's being humble about and saying Torah prevents me. But why isn't he complimentary of his friend's fear of sin and saying, hey, he earned that?
Okay.
About himself, he can say, I didn't earn it.
Like he did to Rav Yosef.
Like Rav Nachman did to Rav Yosef by
Rav Nachman
saying,
did to Rav
hey,
Yosef
about being fear of
earning.
That's right. Rav Nachman says to Rav Yosef, you earned fear of sin and therefore you can't be so humble.
Right.
So why didn't Rav Yosef say the same thing back to Rav Nachman? You are fearful of sin.
Right. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Instead of just saying, I'm not humble.
Okay.
He could also compliment his friend. So it says the Gemara like this. It says the Rebbe like this. The Gemara tells us an unbelievable story. And this story is cited as one of the origins for the yarmulke. You may know the story. For the kippah. Yarmulke, I'm using that terminology because yarmulke is a combination of two words. Yarei Malka. Malka in Aramaic, which means king. So yarmulke means Yarei Malka, fear of the king. It's a reminder that there's a king above us, that God's above us. And that is taken from the following story. The Emad Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. The mother of Rav Nachman, son of Yitzchak, Amrila Kaldoi. There were certain Chaldeans who told her. In the parentheses, there were quotes from Rashi, stargazers. Stargazers told Rav Nachman's mother, Brich Ganvahu. Your son is going to be a thief. He has a tendency for kleptomania. Essentially what they told her, Loishavsky Gluyeresha. He shouldn't be let around. Sorry, Loishavsky Gluyeresha. He shouldn't be led around with his head exposed. And Amrale, they indeed told her, Reishach, you're right. Good idea to keep his head covered. Kihechi, so that to have Allah a most of the Shemayas, they should have a fear of heaven on him. Likewise, so she had two instructions, one of which she already did, it seems, to prevent her son from exercising his kleptomania. Yarmulke on the head, to remind him that there's God above him, and she should daven. She should pray to keep him, right? Bakish Rachmim, as Rashi says, seek out God's mercy, that the Yetzer Hara should not take hold of him. Gemara says, Pamachas, one time, it fell off. Alima Yitzrei, his Yetzer Hara was overcoming him and he couldn't hold himself back. The Gemara describes it. Okay. So now what do we see from this story? What do we see from the story in the line of what we're thinking? Why is Rav Nachman not sinning? Because of the kippah, not because he was transformed. But the fear of Hashem, not because he was transformed, but because there's an exterior factor holding him back. Not because he himself has been transformed into a person fearful of sin. His kleptomania is still there.
Rav Yossi's,
and that's Rav Yossi's position, which is why I can't compliment this friend of Nachman. So let's continue. The true virtue of being, quote, fearful of sin is not simply because a person technically doesn't do sin. That's not called fear of sin. The fact that a person doesn't sin could be for other reasons. For example, she's afraid of punishment. Fear of punishment is not fear of sin. That's fear of punishment. Also, a person can be afraid of his own teacher. A person can be afraid of the social status that will happen if he sins. There are a million considerations a person might think before he sins. He's afraid of being caught. He's afraid of going to jail. He's afraid of God's retribution. That's not fear of sin. That's fear of consequence. What's real fear of sin? He's afraid of the sin itself. Even if he never got caught, even if God came him and said, there's a 2-for-1 free today. If you sin, no punishment today. he still won't sin because the sin itself is to him something he's afraid of. It's a mid yare. It's a fear. Midah shebalev. It's a attribute in his heart, not just something else exterior holding him back, but in his heart he feels that fear. Lavar al ratzon Hashem, to disgrace, to go to transgress God. That's the fear. It's the fear of sin itself. Sin is a detachment from Hashem, and the notion of being attached from Hashem, that is something he's deathly afraid of. That's true fear of sin. So in the Sikha, this is what I want to point out. In this talk, we get the Rebbe's definition of humility, which we discussed yesterday. The person acknowledging that everything he has is a gift from Hashem, not being delusional or lying to himself that I don't have any virtues. I know I have virtues, but they're a gift from Hashem. And here too, we're getting the definition of what it means to be fearful of sin. It's fear of the sin itself, not the consequences of the sin. Social pressures. I don't know. My wife's gonna leave me. My kids are gonna look down at me. 1,000 reasons. To the reason of I'm afraid Hashem's gonna punish me. I don't want to lose out in the world to come. This is not fear of sin. This is fear of consequence. And if Hashem came to you and guaranteed you'll still get your fear of world to come, go ahead, sin today. Would you sin or not? True fear of sin is the very fact that you're disconnecting from Hashem. That itself is what I'm afraid of. So even if I'm told no consequences, it doesn't make a difference. I don't want to detach from Hashem. That's true fear of sin, where the person feels that.
But you just said if Hashem told you.
No, he said you won't get punished today.
Oh,
He said, look, the sin still exists, but you won't get punished. Don't worry about it. If Hashem said that, right? If Hashem said to do it, it's not a sin anymore. Hashem said to do it, right? Right. If Hashem said, look, the punishment, the sin is still a sin, but you won't get punished today, right?
It's not the keeper that keeps me back. And it's not the Torah that keeps me back. It's reading about the angels, that there's one angel out there assigned to every person. Each person has his own angel.
Keep track.
And he writes everything down.
Everything
is written down.
That's a very good level.
That scares me.
It's a very good level. It's not what he's talking about here. Here he's talking about a deeper level, where the very fact that I'm engaging in an act that detaches me from God, that itself is something I don't want to engage in. Now, if that's the way the person feels, then he doesn't require a yarmulke or anything else to hold him back. It's the very feeling he has that he can't do that. In the same way, I don't need any exterior explanation or force to tell me not to jump into a fire. I have to be reminded. It's painful. The thing itself is painful. So the notion of detaching from Hashem is painful enough. I don't have to have a yarmulke or anything else. And therefore, continues the Rebbe, the fear of Rav Nachman that he experienced from not sinning, based on the story above, with the fact that he had the tendency for kleptomania, and the yarmulke holds him back, and the prayer of his mother holds him back. Because Rav Yosef is therefore consistent in his view, because this fact that Rav Nachman doesn't sin is because of the yarmulke, the covering on his head, and prayer. This is not fear of sin essentially embedded in his heart and soul. It's an external force. Rather, on the contrary, the yarmulke has to, every time, renew and remind him, hey, you can't sin. As the Gemara says, a must of the Shemaya, the fear of heaven, has to be on him. Which is why, right, the Gemara says that when the yarmulke fell off one time, his Yetzer Hara came roaring back.
So isn't this another level of Rav Yossi's humility by not pointing out the flawed argument of Rav Nachman?
Oh, that's a good point. Why it's not? He doesn't explicitly knock him down.
That there's fear of sin, but really, under Rav Yossi's opinion,
Okay, it's not. It's correct.
And he doesn't mention it because it's
Doesn't want,
part of
because
his humility.
I guess so. He doesn't want to start pointing fingers and saying, "Hey, you're not really fear of sin." He just leaves it out.
Right.
Yeah, that's good.
Unlike Rav Nachman, who pointed out.
Rav Nachman, who says
he argued against.
You should claim. Yeah, you're saying you should claim.
You earned it.
You earned your yiras. You earned your fear of sin.
Claim humility, but he's
right.
not refuting, even though this is an direct refutation.
Yeah. Unless in Rav Nachman's view,
and I think that's another.
Rav Nachman would argue that the yarmulke on my head actually made me into a person that's fearful of sin. Just like your Torah made you into a person that's fear of sin, perhaps. Which is why Rav Nachman himself says, "I'm fearful of sin." Right?
Just interesting about the silence part of it.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's true. They don't point things at each other, but by omission. It's only by omission. It's all by omission.
Right.
The argument is by omission, not by and perhaps you're
they're
correct.
both by omission.
Correct.
Oh,
They're both by
okay.
omission.
Oh, okay.
They're both by omission. They both don't comment on the
So
other,
Rabbi's,
which is the Rebbe is interpreting that omission to mean that they disagree. So, but maybe you're right. The reason why they don't outright disagree, but rather leave it to omission, is for the same reason. They don't want to point flaws in the other.
Right.
But by omission, they're demonstrating what they truly think. Perhaps that's a good point. Yes. Top of 35 on the left side. The Gamma is any Yiddishkeit. And therefore, with the yarmulke on the head, Rav Yosef would argue this is not true fear of sin. It's quite possible for the evil inclination to come roaring back. In addition to the yarmulke, his mother had to daven. My day calls in through all of this. There was no transformation within him. That he should become called the person that's fear of sin. It's an he was saved by an external force from actually performing sin, but not because he himself was transformed. Consistent with Rav Yosef's view above, the Pulas HaTorah, with the effect of Torah, that prevented him from sinning. Okay, we're going to skip number 7. Number 7, the Rebbe gets into a different dispute in halacha, where you have this idea of a reality that either transforms the situation or prevents the situation. But we're going to put that aside, and we're going to go to ches, which is on the right, bottom right of page 36. Yeah, bottom right of 36. We're skipping Zion. It gives a halachic example for this dispute of does something that's there prevent something or transform? A case of not being able to daven in the presence of. Now, in the last 2 paragraphs, everybody's going to discuss now how we understand in the last 2-3 paragraphs. Page 36 in the bottom ches, the bottom right. How we understand the humility of Moshe Rabbeinu and Rabbi. So let's see. We understand now Rav Nachman of Yosef's position. But what's the Mishnah's position regarding Rabbi's humility? Because in their view, in the Mishnah's view, once Rabbi passed, there's no longer humility, no longer fear of sin. Additionally, Moshe Rabbeinu had humility, most humble man of all people. So how do we understand that in light of all the above? So let's see. Ches. But according to this, we have to understand the following. The Das of Nachman. In Rav Nachman's view, that Torah transforms the very person that learns it. That he becomes a person who's truly fearful of sin, not just Torah preventing him, as was Rav Yosef's view. So in Rav Yosef's view, even a person who studies Torah and therefore doesn't sin, he can remain humble because he didn't become a person who doesn't sin. It's Torah preventing him. So in Rav Yosef's view, even a person who studies Torah and as a result doesn't sin, remain humble. But in Rav Nachman's view, where a person who studies Torah then earns the right to say, hey, I'm no longer sinning because I've been transformed. She said, and this comes because of his own effort, not simply a gift from Hashem, but because he used the Torah to work through himself and transform and become a person who's no longer who's fear of sin. And Cain, if so, how could Rabbi be an anav? How could Rabbi of the Mishnah, who certainly learned lots of Torah, and certainly became transformed into a person who doesn't sin, to the point, as I mentioned when we learned the Gemara, that Rabbi said, I never enjoyed anything of this physical world, even though he's super wealthy, but never for his own enjoyment. So how could he be humble? In Rav Nachman's view, where he says, I'm not humble because, hey, I earned fear of sin, and he says to his friend of Yosef, you shouldn't be humble because you earned fear of sin. So shouldn't you say the same thing about Rabbi? You earned the fear of sin. And they said, and Baaloscha how much more so Moshe, Kibbutz Sinai. Moshe received the Torah from Sinai. So certainly Torah transformed Moshe Rabbeinu. Sorry?
But he still got punished.
Okay,
For
sorry.
being humble.
Sorry?
He was so humble, he got punished.
For his humility?
Yeah.
For hitting the rock.
Well, it was.
It's humility? I don't know if that's humility.
He lost it.
I wouldn't go so far. The manner in which Hashem punishes tzaddikim with Moshe Rabbeinu is not on the same level that we operate. But the point I was making here is like this. Moshe Rabbeinu received the Torah from Sinai. But Torah nikras al shmoi. Torah is called the Torah of Moshe. Why is it called the Torah of Moshe? Because he's so Torah was so ingrained in him, and he so became one with Torah that we can call Torah's Moshe's Torah. Is it not the case that in them, Rabbi and Moshe Rabbeinu, Paul HaTorah, Shinu v'Chidush, Torah transformed them and renewed them to be people who are fear of sin? So if Rab Nachman is of the view that anyone who learned Torah to the point that it becomes fearful of sin, that's something he can't be humble about. He has bragging rights, so to speak, that he earned the fear of sin, which is why he says, hey, humility is gone, because Yudav Yosef earned fear of sin, and so did I. So should not that be true of Rebbe and Moshe Rabbeinu? That they should seemingly not be humble, considering that they earned their fear of sin because of all the Torah they learned and how the Torah transformed them. Should that not be the case? This is Rebbe's question. So here we're going to get to something that was pointed out 2 days ago or a few days ago with regard to the change in generations. Now there's 3 levels of humility here. Moshe Rabbeinu, there's Rabbi Yehuda, and the generation of Rabbi Yosef. So let's understand how Rebbe and Moshe Rabbeinu must be on a higher level, where even though they certainly were transformed by Torah, they still can claim humility. Following? So let's see. Top left of page 36. We might suggest the explanation, says the Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe explains in Likkutei Torah the machlokes Pinchas ben Yair, Rabbi Shua ben Levi. There's a dispute in the Gemara. I think it's actually okay. The footnote's back. Okay. So there's a dispute between a Pinchas ben Yair and Rabbi Shua ben Levi. Here's the dispute: is humility lower than fear of sin, or is humility higher than fear of sin? Which one's higher, fear of sin or humility? Now these are the two characters in question here. Which one's a higher virtue, humility or fear of sin? And this is a dispute between a Pinchas ben Yair and a Rabbi Shua ben Levi. And says the Alter Rebbe, yep,
like these two,
they come together.
They're so interconnected.
That's right.
That if you affect one, it affects the
That's
other.
correct.
So it's
That's
hard
exactly.
to, how do you, it's like this is a mind puzzle that is
absolutely correct.
To solve.
Absolutely correct. So in the Mishnah, the two are put together. Rabbi had humility and fear of sin, and when he died, they're both gone. But the Gemara splits them. Rav Yosef says humility, and Rav Nachman says fear of sin. So how do we do that? So till now, we've been making this kind of interplay where humility is the acknowledging everything is a gift from Hashem, and fear of sin means, well, no, I earned something.
So
I earned fear of sin.
You lose the humility.
Right, which then you lose humility, right?
But the humility is what gave you that.
Exactly. So that's right. And I guess that's the dispute between a Pinchas ben Yair and Rabbi Shua ben Levi. Which one do I put on the higher notch? So says the Alter Rebbe, there's a number of levels of humility. Some levels of humility are below fear of sin, and some are higher. And the Alter Rebbe gives the following Kabbalistic geography, which the Rebbe will explain. Humility, which results in and brings about fear of sin, that comes from the level called bina, intelligence, understanding. But the humility that transcends everything, that comes from the level of keser, the level of transcendence. Kabbalistic language. What does this mean? Explains the Rebbe. We'll be signing Pashat Yoser in more simple terms. Humility that comes from understanding. It is the kind of humility that comes out of reasoning, reckoning, and calculation. The kind of calculation we described above regarding the humility of Moshe Rabbeinu and Rabbi Yosef. Because they think if someone else was granted the talents and capabilities that I have, he would do better. That's one level of humility. It's a kind of humility which I can understand and work toward on an intellectual level. I understand that everything I have is a gift. I look at a friend and say, hey, look, he wasn't granted the same gifts, and therefore I'm better than him because I was granted these gifts. Maybe if Hashem granted him the gifts, he might do better. So this is a rational deduction that leads me to humility.
That's Rav Yossi's.
That's Rav Yosef's humility. But says the Rebbe, this is a lower level of humility. What's the higher level? But no, because that comes from being, that comes from understanding. It's a rationality.
And that's what Rav Nachman used to counter argue, right?
Correct.
At lower level.
That's right. You earned your humility. You earned your fear of sin. If your whole humility is based on
that down as not being human.
That's correct, because exactly. Because your humility is based on the fact that you understand that this is a gift from Hashem. Your fear of sin wasn't a gift; you earned that.
Right, but the way you
then
this is saying there's a higher.
That's
level.
correct. The humility that comes from the level of keser, keser, the level of transcends. It's not a calculation that leads me to the conclusion that I ought to be humble, but it's an inherent humility that just exists within the person as an a priori, not because he concluded that it must be humility.
I mean, it was innate in him.
It's innate. It's innate from who I am. It's just who I am at the very core, not because I've calculated that, hey, in other words, like this.
You didn't earn it.
What is my exactly? Is my humility a counteraction to my arrogance? Or just I have no arrogance to begin with? So it could be the counteraction to arrogance. I'm an arrogant person. I'm self-assured because hey, look how good I am. But then I have to counter that by saying, hey, hold on a second. You're good. That's true. That's a gift. You can't just run around bragging about that. It's a gift. But that is a dialogue that I have internally. I start out with arrogance and I respond with the reason to be humble.
It's a rational.
That's a lower level of humility. Because to begin with, you started off with self.
You acknowledge you earned it.
Exactly. You start with self and you have to counter.
It's not really me.
That's correct. You start off with self. That's your a priori. And then you counteract with the higher level of humility is to begin with, there's no self. And there's no self that has to argue. That's right. There's no self that I have to counteract.
So it wasn't learned through Torah.
It's not learned, exactly. It's a much deeper, innate, inherent humility. It's just who I am. But it's not who I am. There's no self. Then it goes further. Let's see. This is unbelievable. This is unbelievable. Tess, bottom left of 36. A proof to the above, that there is this notion of humility inherently, not just calculated. Beyond reckoning and calculation and rationality. How do we know that such humility exists? We find humility as a quality that God has. The Amr Razal, our sages say, in the place of God greatness, of God, you find this humility. It's a famous Gemara in Megillah. We're in the same place where you find God's greatness, you find his humility. When it comes to God, you can't make the calculation. What calculation is God making? Hey, my greatness is a gift from God. The whole calculation doesn't begin. So why is Hashem humble? Because he is. It's not a calculation that leads Hashem to saying, oh, I must be humble.
He chooses.
Exactly. It's an inherent thing. Hashem decided he's humble. Period. It's not a humility that comes as a result of a calculation. Hashem says, hey, the whole calculation doesn't begin for Hashem. For a person who's the recipient of God's gifts, you can have a calculation to counteract the fact that I feel arrogant. But for Hashem, no such calculation exists.
So there's no higher level of humility for people then.
Only
Hashem.
That was just demonstrating kiltzi.
Okay.
That was just demonstrating that the notion of inherent humility exists.
It exists.
Exactly.
But as far as we know at this
humility
moment,
doesn't. That's right. The point is, humility doesn't have to have a calculation at the point. Proof: Hashem doesn't have one; he still has humility. Okay. Humility is not contingent on a rational calculation. It could just be inherent. That's the proof. Here's the proof. There is such an idea of humility that doesn't come as a result of any calculation. Another be'etzem, an inherent, essential, existential humility.
How do we fold that now into?
So let's go now to the top of page 37. We're skipping the paragraph on top where there's a parentheses. So the second paragraph at the top of 37. Similarly, this is the virtue of the humility of Moshe Rabbeinu. In addition to what we explained earlier, that he made the calculation, that if someone else was granted my capacity, that person would do better. That was true of Moshe Rabbeinu, but that was his lower level of humility. That was a calculated humility. The Rabbi is suggesting that Moshe Rabbeinu had another level of humility. In addition to that, he had that humility works for the kinds of things that he achieved, saying, hey, 1 second, someone else might have done better. The work he does after receiving gifts from Hashem, he says, hey, someone else might have used that the gift better. This is the kind of humility that comes out of reckoning, calculation, and rationality. The fact that Moshe Rabbeinu was humble, despite his virtue as a prophet, top left of 37, this is because inherently and existentially, he was a man that did not see self. And therefore he's completely humble before everybody. Not because of any calculation, because just who he is, at the very core.
God saw that right at the beginning when he saw Moshe carrying that little lamb.
That's correct. This is why he was chosen to be the leader.
Care for a little lamb like that.
Not because of any calculation, because just who he is.
Yeah.
We have a few more minutes. Okay, let's conclude. Right? This is.
Now we have to know why when Rabbi died and.
Okay, so Rabbi doesn't address it directly, but I 1 second. This
it stopped when they died.
That's right.
Not when Moshe Rabbeinu died.
Yes, so Rabbi
carried the similar qualities as Rav Moshe.
That's right.
Moshe Rabbeinu.
1 second. I think there was a footnote somewhere that addressed that. Where is it? Because Rabbi here addresses Moshe Rabbeinu, not Rabbi.
Must be by inference then.
Yeah.
That they carried.
That Rabbi carried the same quality, which is why I said it ends with him. That's why he says it ends.
Rabbi is bringing the proof of Moshe Rabbeinu.
Yeah.
As the proof.
Oh, here, what? It's in 50. It's in 52.
So it must be.
Yeah, in 52 Rabbi addresses this. Yeah, so it would seem therefore that Rabbi carried that same quality, which is why specifically when he passed, humility is done. In Rav Nachman's view. Okay, let's conclude, and this is going to be at least some inspiration for our learning Gemara, especially as on Monday we start Arvei Psachim, which is going to be very different than what we've done till now on Sotah, which is more some of it more inspirational. It's Pesach Sheni today, that's right. But Arvei Psachim is going to be a lot of halacha, a lot of like legal thinking and analysis. So let's see the last closing remarks. Roll up the sleeves, exactly right. And this is let's see the comment here. Nini Yadua, it's well known. On top of the left of 37, where it says Yud, like the word Yud is spelled out, the letter Yud is spelled out as a word. Nini Yadua, it's well known. Shadafka Yidei Oifen Alimud the Bavli, specifically in the kind of learning that's done in the Babylonian Talmud, namely the kind of learning that takes effort, work, counter argument, back and forth, as opposed to the Jerusalem Talmud, which just has conclusions. The Bavli, we know this already. We're sitting around the table for a few years. Like I'm going to go back and forth and a counter argument, and then a page and a half, and then conclude. Well, no, it's actually a different way of thinking about it. This constant like working through. It's specifically that kind of learning. This is how we connect to the level of Keser, which transcends the divine, the system. It's God's transcendence. This is a well-known idea in Chassidus, that the way in which a person can reach the transcendent, which really we can't, because we're humans. How do we reach the transcendent? So explains Chassidus, the way to reach the transcendent is by pushing oneself. When you transcend your own limitations, that's when you reach the infinite. And that happens specifically in the learning of the Gemara of Bavel, which requires effort. And sometimes you got to stretch the elastics of your brain to try to understand a little bit more and to push the limits of what that specifically reach the transcendence. So this transcendent humility we're talking about comes out of the efforts of Bavel, the efforts of learning Gemara, but not the, sorry?
Doesn't that contradict the whole notion of what he started to say, that this level of transcendent humility doesn't come from rationalization? It's divinely given. It's transcendent.
It's innate.
And now you're saying that, not you, but I'm saying, now it's saying that to achieve this transcendent level, you have to toil.
Right. Yes, but it's not the rationality that leads you to that humility. It's the fact that you pushed yourself that helps you reach that transcendence. It's not because you came.
It's almost like a light switch. It's like you toil, but it's not the toil itself that creates the humility. It's
It's
all
the
of a
fact that
sudden
you pushed yourself.
You went from finite to infinite.
Correct.
In a bleep.
Correct.
And
It's not. That's right.
And one didn't cause the other.
That's right. It's not as
in
if
a
you.
sense,
That's
but
correct.
In a way, it did.
That's
I don't
right.
know.
It's not as if you neatly stacked your rationality to the point now you've reached infinite.
Right. It just,
On the contrary,
it just had to
it's you
cross
pushed yourself.
over.
That's right. You pushed yourself so far that it just opens up this window to something beyond.
Okay.
That's the idea, because you pushed yourself,
Wow.
not the rationality, but because you pushed yourself.